Hello. Thank you, everybody, for who's here in person and online, and thank you especially to Leon Conrad for encouraging to write this paper and giving really useful revisions to it, and also Nisha, who isn't here but might be online. I'm going to talk around the kind of slides, and so it's not really going to follow exactly what I claimed I would do in the abstract. And really, for me, the goal here is to share with you what I think Samuel or Delany's reading of Spencer Brown was. I think that he's kind of reading Spencer Brown quite against the grain, and I'll try to elaborate on what I think by that. But just in case people don't know who Samuel or Delany is, I've put a bit of the Wikipedia, good place to start, always, up on the screen. He's a science fiction writer and literary critic, and also a sociologist who has written things about the sociology of public sex acts, mainly homosexual, and is an amazing fantasy writer. I think it might sometimes be an understatement to refer to him as a transgressive writer in some ways, but a really, really compelling and amazing writer. And I think is really at a deeply rooted level a feminist writer as well. Whenever he's in interviews talking about what he's writing, what he sees his project as, he'll often talk about his marriage to the poet Marilyn Hacker, and in particular, little anecdotes which made him think about how he was socialized as a man, namely examples like how different he would be growing up in a world where his particular pants didn't have pockets or had much smaller pockets, which is something that he would talk with his partner about at that time. I want to start near the end by just sharing what I think the relation between the two writers is right up top. I'll start by talking about Triton, which was published in 1976. Originally called Triton, later released as Trouble on Triton. And it's a science fiction novel, which has a main character, protagonist named Bron Hellstrom, who comes from a city named Bologna, which is on Mars. And Bron is living in the satellites around Triton. And it follows his kind of life as he falls in love with a woman named the Spike. And Bron is not a likable character by any means. Quite arrogant, quite self-centered, not very good at relating to other people or listening or asking questions. And the first bit of the novel that Delany wrote was the Spike's reply after a bad date to Bron, where the Spike is articulating why he's so difficult as a person and why she doesn't want to be with the type of person who he is. So that was the kind of seed or germ of the novel. And after that, it kind of has these interesting covers which imply kind of intergalactic battles and things like this. Fundamentally, it's a kind of comedy of manners. It's about a relationship. It's set in a science fictional world where it's described that there are like 50 genders, and people can cross between genders and races quite easily due to technological advancements. This is the kind of world that Delany is picturing and painting, okay? And within that, to go a little bit back and relate this to the conference, when Andrew opened our conference and was talking about crypsis and attempts to baffle a distinction, I do think that there's something fundamental in the way that Delany is reading Spencer Brown, where he is often seeking not to draw distinctions, but to take a distinction as drawn and then to smudge it or blur it. And I'll try to substantiate that. I want to first talk about that at the level of form in the novel, in little micro moments. So Bron, near the end of the novel, has had a sex change and is seeking a partner and goes to a place to go on a date. there are different counters which are being described here, where one can go to kind of signal what kind of relationship one has to the space and whether or not one wants to be approached by somebody or not. So I'll just quickly read it because Bron is reacting to the set of choices in front of Bron. And you'll see what happens. What they need here, of course, is 3 counters. One for the ones who want to approach, and then one for the people who want to be approached, then one for the people who wouldn't mind being approached. But no, that wasn't the answer. There wasn't any difference between not minding it and wanting it, but just wanting it a little less. Well, then 4 counters. With a vision of an infinite regression of counters, each with fewer and fewer people at it, until she herself and alone stood at the last, Bron took her place at the center of free range, where indeed a plurality of the reasonable and happy women and men in the place had gathered. So, I argued in another paper, I won't summarize it here, but basically, this is kind of practicing, I think, calculus at the level of description, in the sense that you have a counter or a rectangle underneath a curve. Originally there's 2, then there's 3, then we get an infinite regression of them or progression of them. And yeah, I think that this is, although it looks like it's just prose, I think there's a way in which you can read this as practicing calculus at the level of writing. And this is another fragment from Triton, which does the same thing, but I think from the opposite side, right? So I'll read it out now. Bron set the cup down and fingered up the thick pad. So sorry, just a scene setting. This is chapter 2. Bron is playing a game. It's good that Zachary was talking about chess because it's a game kind of a bit chess-like. It's called Vlet, but it's really, really, as you can probably tell, very, very complicated, much more complicated than chess. And he's at this time looking at this scoring modulus, or even just a small fragment of it. So Bron set the cup down and fingered up the thick pack. He unwrapped the blue silk cloth from around it. Along the napkin's edge, gold threads embroidered, and then the equation. I won't try to read it out. The rather difficult modulus by which the even more difficult scoring system, Warren had not taught him that yet, but he only knew that theta was a measurement of strategic angles of attack over different sorts of terrain, N, M, and A, and that small ones netted more points than large ones preceded. Okay, so how do we kind of read this? Well, I want to present a reading of it which is extremely surface, which is to say that it's kind of nonsense equation at several levels. Delany has said this in interviews that it's meant to be complete gobbledygook, but also that it's performing that kind of level of bafflement for people who want to make certain kinds of distinctions. And it's also doing it at the level of kind of some of what we might carry over from Spencer Brown, which is gendered and genred expectations, okay? Which is to say that we have the kind of quote unquote high seriousness of mathematical notation, but producing absolute nonsense. And the nonsense that's producing is also kind of being gendered. The best reading I can come up with is A, that it's kind of pointless because we have magnitudes. The ends only appear within the magnitude symbol bars. So I don't know why it's minus here. And also that the constants spell out man. So man is constant in the equation. And I messaged Delany earlier in the year, and I luckily got a reply because I knew, because in Triton, what I haven't mentioned and I will show soon, is that there are 2 epigraphs taken from laws of form. So what he also wrote it in London in 1973 to 1974. Okay, so I messaged him and I asked him a lot of questions. He didn't answer most of the questions, but he did say that he read Only Two Can Play This Game, didn't like it, I think possibly understatement here, but yeah, I think that that's going to be rooted in the really quite rigorous gender binary that's set up in Only Two Can Play This Game from the dust jacket. and also the undercurrents around homosexuality that are commented on in that book, and also later on in the autobiography. But yeah, and also little moments like this, like when James Keyes says, in Laws of Form, I attempted to stay as far as I could the masculine side of things. Just as in the present book, I try again, as far as my limited talents allow, to say something of the feminine side. The two books are thus, in some respects, companion volumes. So we have this gender distinction being made, kind of being mapped onto genre, with mathematics versus poetry, right? But that, to invoke Zachary's talk earlier again, that is again being kind of, and to invoke Andrew's point, that's kind of being baffled or smudged here at most levels, insofar as this is also embroidered, right? And embroidery is usually, as Zachary mentioned, codified as a feminine side of things, but also implicit in embroidery, as the Palestinian mathematician was quoted, is a sense of computing, and as Leon, I'm sure, is well aware and very conscious of. And even the earliest computers, like Charles Babbage's work, I think, was to do with textiles and other things like this, fabrics. So yeah, I will also move on to some other little examples now. So that's a kind of claim about Triton. Now we have more specific examples of the dialogue. Okay, so really now I'm getting to the evidence from which I have made my claims. Dahlgren is a book published by Delany. It's a novel published in 1975, and it is set in another city named Bellona again, but this city is now on Earth. It's a very unusual city in which the inhabitants regularly observe 2 moons. There are no laws. There's gangs of people roaming around who are kind of modeled on the Hells Angels. There's a lot of sex in the book. There's a lot of promiscuity. And yeah, it's got a main character called the Kid, who's can't remember his name. And we kind of follow him as he finds a notebook, writes lots of poems in it, crosses and recrosses the poems out. And several times overhears a character named Reverend Amy, who is often, I think, well, definitely is replying to Spencer Brown's Laws of Form. Okay. So this is a quote here. Who lives in this city? Reverend Amy's voice came on through a lull. Logicians love it here. George turned to listen. So did the gaunt girl and Glass. Here you can cleave a space with a distinction, mark, or token, and not have it bleed all over you. Now, that might be, the way that I tend to read that personally is that Bellona is a very particular space where things are unusual. This is constantly emphasized through the appearance of a much larger sun and a second moon. So it's being invoked that in most other places, a mark or a distinction is going to bleed, smudge, do these things. So I think that in a way, there's a kind of pushing against of the assertion by Spencer Brown in Laws of Form, or that's initially how I read it. Then there's citations of Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, and we also have things around attention being invoked. Now, later on, a different character, sorry, that's a bit fast, but a different character named Lanya talks about wanting to write a book called Preliminary Notes Toward a Calculus of Attentional and Intentional Perception with an Analytics of Modular Feedback. Wants it to have a third of mathematical symbols. Well, Triton is kind of Delany trying to write Lanya's book, okay? Because the subtitle of Trouble on Triton is Some Informal Remarks Toward the Modular Calculus Part 1. And Delany keeps writing this throughout another science fiction and fantasy series, The Tales of Nivarian. So he really is trying to do some of the things that are set out in this book. Also, please interrupt me at any point if I'm moving too quickly or you want to ask any questions, okay? I'll go back once again to Reverend Amy. This is Reverend Amy being overheard again. mid-sentence. Of the crossing taken again is not the value of the crossing. Oh, my poor inaccurate hands and eyes. Don't you know that once you have transgressed that boundary, every atom, the interior of every point of reality has shifted its relation to every other you've left behind, shaken and jangled within the field of time, so that if you cross back, you return to a very different space from the one you left. You have crossed the river to come to this city. Do you really think you can cross back to a world where a blue sky goes violet in the evening, buttered over with the light of a single silver moon? So she's saying, you're naive inhabitants of this particular city, Bologna, if you think you can just cross the boundary again and go back to the same place because you've been in this city, Bologna, where you've seen 2 moons, and you're going to be carrying a residue of that with you. And that by crossing that boundary, something has changed. This has a direct homology, I think, as well with an earlier plot point, which is that there's an astronaut character called Captain Camp who talks about visiting the moon and says, I never returned to Earth because the Earth I returned to was changed. I left an Earth which was not an extraterrestrial civilization, and I returned to one which was. And there's a little bit of a trick there with sneaking in a qualitative element, but also I think that there's something, I think that that's how Delany fundamentally is reading Spencer Brown. He's adding a lot of qualitative detail. He's playing with adding nonsense to it. He's taking the laws of form and scribbling all over it as much as he can as a surface, right? Like he does it. That's what he wants to do with it. Maybe to smudge it. Yes.
You're saying cross again.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
The value of the law of crossing, as we interpret it, says we come back to where we started if we do it twice.
Yeah.
Not here.
Yes. So it's a different setup, right? It's a revision to that particular law within law of form and a disagreement with it. So you're going to it's setting up a calculus where you're carrying residues of things, or things are changing by the very act of drawing a distinction. Or there are distinctions, as I said, which are pre-existing and not interested in talking about what observer makes the distinction, but how can they be smudged? How can they be blurred? How do they bleed, right?
I guess really inside. Sorry. Yeah. I guess then when you look at the law of crossing in terms of an abstract primary distinction or a system of distinctions, it's a particular kind of context. And I think what Delany is doing there is this is within human experience is creating a new distinction rather than actually crossing. So it's a new system of distinctions rather than strictly speaking and crossing of that boundary.
Yeah. I think that's really useful. Yeah. And yeah, I think that he when he writes about laws of form, he's definitely, I'm wondering if he kind of, he doesn't that often say that he's reading it against the grain or that he's transposing it to a different context or to a new set of rules. But I think that he is, and he seems to be a little bit secretive about it, which is interesting to me. I'll give another example of that now, which I hope will be quite quickly. Delany is in an interview here in 1975, so it's the same year that Dahlgren is published. No, sorry, it's not an interview. It's a preface to Joanna Russ's work, who's a science fiction writer. And he's basically saying that there's a relation between fantasy and science fiction, and the relation is the same as between, Boolean algebra and the trivial or simple calculus. So he's saying that the relation between fantasy is between the same as that relation. And then he starts to give some examples because he's being asked to, he gives an example of reflection, which I have here. And again, he seems to be switching it a little bit, yes, in his reading. And he says that if he's wearing he gives an example of this, he attributes an argument to Spencer Brown, which is that the value of a content is reversed by its image, but to go on to an image of an image gives us a new content to deal with. An example, my own, not Brown's, might be a t-shirt with a word written across it, such as mine. If I put the t-shirt on and look into a mirror, at the image, I see the word reversed. But if I put another mirror behind me, then I'll see the back of the t-shirt. But again, I think that that's very different to what I read in Spencer Brown, which is that the reversal will bring you back to the content. But he's saying that it will also be a different or a new content. I'll now speed up a little bit to leave room for questions. He keeps invoking Spencer Brown throughout his life and his career. A reflection of a reflection does even more complicated things, as Spencer Brown's little book of Calculus of Indications, The Laws of Form. He later kind of corrects himself through another character, I think, because he makes the mistake sometimes. It can really change the meaning, a character says in a book called Dark Reflections, which I think, so he's obsessed with reflections and art as a mirror. Dark Reflections is basically an autobiography of himself if he was a poet who was also sexually repressed. He's not a poet and he's not sexually repressed. He's a science fiction writer. So it's like an inverted world that he's writing. But in the inverted world, his character critiques his own little slip-ups and is always talking about the laws of form. And just one other thing, which is just these are the epigraphs which are used in Trouble on Triton as well. And he also uses epigraphs from Laws of Form in a commentary on another science fiction story. He has a little small essay on the origin of language where he gives this quote from Laws of Form. And also he begins to sometimes acknowledge the revisions to Laws of Form when he is writing under a pseudonym. Writing as his own kind of critic, he creates an alter ego critic who can't choose between maths and German literature. It's a smudging of a distinction, maybe. And also is interested in category theory. Okay, and this is in 1986 in a preface to the fantasy series. And then this critic, who is Delany, says, this has critiques, parodies, and dialogues with Spencer Brown's The Laws of Form, amongst many other texts, including, I think Lyle mentioned this already, like Wizard of Oz and other things. But yeah, I won't go through any more. I will leave it there to allow space for questions. But yeah, that's, I think, a little bit of a presentation about Delany's reading of Spencer Brown, and possibly where he's rubbing up against it and producing there's some tension, I think, but really interesting tension.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, we can open it up now. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate the almost postmodern take on the work of Spencer Brown, but I also really enjoyed the little discussion that was just had about Delany sketching that you cannot go back after crossing the river, and I don't know the specifics of what Spencer Brown really meant, but it really made me think actually of also more postmodern theories on, for example, also entropy, which is something that came back before. And I think about Bruno Latour, a philosopher who comments a lot on ecosystems. And he has this concept of landing on Earth, that since Yuri Gagarin went to outer space, had a view of our world as this blue globe, and then he landed on Earth, and of course with the picture that was made back then, that since then our whole world has changed, and our perception also of how we relate to nature and ourselves has been kind of that we can never go back to how we thought of the globe before, because we didn't see it as a globe. So I just really enjoyed to I never knew about Delany as a writer, but about this element of crossing, and then that you actually, even if you cross back, you'll never be in the same space and time anymore anyways. So it's just a remark. I really kind of was thinking of Gagarin and this phenomenon of what it means to land, or to relate to yourself after crossing and after distinction. So thank you.
Thank you.
Tara, hi. Lovely talk. Thank you. I was just thinking about the implications of the river here. He evokes, it sounds very much to me like a Heraclitus allusion, right? And that this, instead of stepping into the river, you can't do twice, you step over the river, you cross the river, right? And that sounds quite interesting to me, because the question again, what the mark is, and what is the distinction? And if we think of the river flow, and the question, if you can step into the river, and you can't, because you can never step into the river twice, that implicates another interesting problem. I have no solution. It's just an interesting confusion appearing now in my head.
Yeah, and I do think that there's something to do with that, the ship of Theseus stuff, and like little what the definitions might be snuck in that allow that paradox to appear confusing, where allowing in confusion or blurring can be, I'm really interested in this as well. I don't have full thoughts about it, but I think that to me as well, this is almost a question between moving between continuous and discrete measurement or form, right? Like, which is the whole issue of, it's not issue, but that's why calculus is so fascinating, right? It's like, why doesn't it break? Why go into infinite number of boxes, discrete boxes? Why do you get a continuous answer, a discrete continuous answer? And I think as well, just before Lou asks a question, Lou, you also brought up René Thom. René Thom is also cited twice in Trouble on Triton. And in particular, he only uses catastrophe once, and it's to describe the experience of this letter of rejection from this woman. And yeah, I think that it's a fascinating to read Trouble on Triton alongside Only Two Can Play This Game, where obviously we don't see a letter from the woman,
I was going to also mention Heraclitus. That passage about crossing, the way he puts it, is like a distortion or a take on Heraclitus. You can't step into the same river twice. But then, as he said, it was across the river, or was it in the river? And then there are a number of thoughts that one ends up playing with, like, can you step into the mark? Or not?
Yeah.
What is the reality of the mark itself? If the mark is imaginary, then you can't step into it, but you can step over it, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So that we actually live in this kind of creative ambiguity with respect to what the mark is, as people studying laws of form. So what he says resonates with us in a very interesting way.
Absolutely. Yes. And I don't have anything to add to that, except that I'll want to listen back to that. But I think that the crossing of the river, just to add more fictional detail, the kid crosses the river, can't remember his name, and then is gifted a weapon. called a brass orchid, which then becomes the name of the poetry collection, and then is leaving the city, and a woman is entering at the same time. So there's gender switches, and gifts has switched places in the story where the story is kind of going to replay. Well, there's a strong sense that the story is going to replay, but now with a female protagonist. And equally, there's a lot in terms of Lanya writing a book or wanting to write a book, which Delany later starts to write. Lanya seems closely modeled on Delany, and the kid might be closely modeled on Marilyn Hacker. And they all enter into a relationship with somebody as a couple, so they become a throuple. And this also happened in Delany's own autobiography. So there's like pretty direct reflections and parallels. Sorry, Leon.
Oh, and so Leon has the final question here,
Yeah.
and but real quick, is it the Wizard of Oz? Is it about the gender switching, like with Pip and Ozma and so on?
I like that. I'm going to have to follow that up. Yeah.
It's re-entrance.
Yes.
It's re-entrance. You've got to. This is the problem with the re-entrant form, and whether it's re-entrant in one level down or two levels down. So that's the confusion. Then the idea that you don't return to where you were if you've got the re-entrant form. The form's identical, but it's really not identical, because you do the continuing fractions. Each expression of the continuing fraction, while it's identical in the form to the one before it, it actually looks different. So that's what we're dealing with here.
Thanks, Lyle.
Yeah, thanks, Lyle. The way it represents itself in story structure, as I've applied the methodology, is that you have a character, that's the mark. And then that character will have some kind of problem. They'll have made some form of a distinction. The character is always going to be at a particular time, at a particular space, in a particular situation, right? If they don't experience a problem, there's no story, really. Let's say a character is on one bank of the river, and their problem is that they need to get to the other side. Now, whether they jump over, fly over, or wade over, or swim over, they are going to be starting on one side of the river. Then, if they enter the water, they will not be on land, they will be in the water. They've crossed a boundary. Then they'll cross another boundary. They'll not be in the water anymore, they'll be on land. But because they've made the distinction of side they started on, side they end up on, they're not going to be in the same place. But if they say, I'm on Earth, I'm just going to walk over the water, they cross the river, but they end up in the same place. They're on Earth. If they think that the river is the same location as the banks, they haven't made a crossing. It's as simple as that. And in story structure, moves either come in triples or in duples. There's a backwards, forwards, backwards. You can expand indefinitely, but you end up with the same qualitative step as you started with. Or you go backwards, forwards, and then it resolves. You have to come to the conclusion of the resolution, and the mark is a new situation. But it's very rare for you to go backwards, forwards, backwards, and the story stop. And I think there's something there that could do with really being unpacked. What are the rules that govern that?
Yeah.
Also, time and space. Till, you mentioned the flowing of the river, that's time, but then you're crossing a space, crossing a boundary. Zeno's paradoxes are full of this. And once upon a time, and all the other openings and closings I found universally are deliberate, hypnotic confusions of space and time. They do this for a reason. They take us across a boundary from the world of the 9 to 5 every day to the world of story and bring us safely back again. And whatever Delany does in his books, he cannot help but do that and follow the rules of story structure. He's playing within the rules of the game.
Oh yeah, real quick. Yeah.
I was just going to ask one question and then make a suggestion for something to explore. The question, simple yes or no question: is there a river described in the city of Bologna in Dahlgren?
It's not really described. It's crossed to enter.
Yeah.
I would need to revise.
Okay. This leads into the second question. That a lot of comparisons have been made with that work in particular with Joyce's literature.
Yes.
So two different ways you can approach
Finnegan's
this.
Way.
Yeah. So Finnegan's Way, but also Ulysses was just about a story about a city and the relationship of moving through the city. But particularly Finnegan's Wake, in that there's a kind of circularity. There's a way of going from the end of the novel to the start of the novel, and there's also ways to read it in non-linear progression. So I wonder if that might relate a little bit to his influence by laws of form.
Yeah, I do think that you're right, and it's absolutely there. But Delany by no means should have the final word on these things. But the critical alter ego writing about Dahlgren insists, and I think in some interviews, but it hasn't stopped Delany from evoking things before. He probably knew about Finnegan's Wake. He insists that he hadn't read it, so he couldn't have been aping it, But equally, that is there. But the critical alter ego also points out that that there's almost like a circuit break in the looping back. So the final sentence and the first sentence loop, but also overlap, because there's a stutter in I come to wound the autumnal city, right? So I come to, and then start of the book, to wound the autumnal city. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
10 seconds.
Okay.
Perhaps initially the looping back is thought of as coincident with time and process and oscillation. But then, as Lyle was saying, if you re-enter at an even depth, then it's possible to have re-entered in the form of memory, and time has stopped. And this is a paradox, which we think is obvious.
Nice one. Thank you.